Hello, everyone. My name is Jamille Pinheiro Diaz, and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the co-director of the Environmental Humanities Research Hub at the University of London's School of Advanced Study. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's event, part of our Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities series. Before we begin, just want to say thank you to Carolyn Fornoff for kindly accepting our invitation, to Gianfranco Selgas from UCL, who worked with me to make this event possible, and Annie Sherratt for her continued support. And of course, many thanks to all of you for joining us today. The Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities series is dedicated to fostering interdisciplinary and transnational dialogues in the field. This is an online series, which means it allows us to feature speakers from around the world, as is the case today with Carolyn, who's based in the US. Please note that this session is being recorded. We will have a Q&A at the end. If you would like to ask a question, please do so in the chat. Today's session will enrich our understanding of how cultural responses can inspire new ways of thinking about pressing ecological issues. Carolyn is a leading scholar at the intersection of Latin American cultural production and environmental crisis, particularly in Mexico. Her work has been inspiring us to highlight art's capacity for speculation, imagination, and possibility, moving beyond the factual, indicative mode of truth-telling. I will now hand it over to Gianfranco, who will continue to introduce our guest speaker, and I look forward to the discussion ahead. Gianfranco, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jamille. Hi, everyone. I will just keep it very short so we have time to listen to Carolyn. But today we're thrilled to launch this term series with the talk Subjunctive Aesthetics and the Poetics of Extinction by Dr. Carolyn Fornoff, who's an assistant professor of Latin American Studies at Cornell University. Her research explores cultural responses to environmental crises in Latin America with a particular focus on Mexico and Central America. In this talk, Dr. Fornoff explores the subjunctive turn in contemporary Mexican cultural production, which embraces art's capacity to plumb uncertainty and speculate about how the world could be different. She argues that subjunctive aesthetics make a bid for art's experimental and experiential capacity to generate alternative narratives, values, and grammars of territorial belonging. This talk will explore how the subjunctive turn manifests in recent Mexican poetry about endangered and extinct species. So with that said, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carolyn Fornoff.
Okay, great. Let me see. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Gianfranco and Jamille, for the generous invitation to speak with this research group. It's just a pleasure to be here today and to talk with all of you about my recent book, which came out with Vanderbilt Press at the start of this year. And I'll be talking at greater length sort of about the primary argument of the book, as well as one of the case studies in the chapter about extinction poetics. Okay, so when I started writing this book, my main goal was to assess what was happening with contemporary Mexican cultural production, sort of broadly understood. I'm thinking about literature, art, and film, and the way that they respond to environmental crisis. And a question that motivated me in this project was really to rethink what art can do beyond the ability to simply make environmental crisis legible or visible. And we might think about this evidentiary mode as one of the dominant modes of the environmental arts, one that positions art as a didactic or a forensic vehicle for proving the urgency of environmental damage, and that really tries to avoid ambiguity in order to achieve political consensus on these issues. The ability of representation to make the invisible visible or to raise public awareness to the facts is illustrated by the image that you see on screen here, which is a photograph of Mexico's Lacandon jungle taken in 2019 by the photographer Santiago Arau, who's really known for his aerial photography. And so you can see, right, the deforestation is sort of immediately legible to the public through the stark contrast of colors and the demarcation of space in this image. This sort of pedagogical or forensic aesthetic is, of course, hugely valuable, and it performs important work. It takes up the task of investigating the truth and amplifying its circulation, or of reconstructing past events and in order to make sense of the senseless. Yet, as I was surveying recent Mexican cultural production, I was struck by how many works that deal with environmental issues actually sort of shift away from this evidentiary mandate to prove the certainty of environmental crisis and are interested in something that I think is altogether a little bit different, right? Which is how to mobilize aesthetics and narratives in order to embrace things that we might think of as counterproductive politically, right? So the doubts, the fears, hypotheses, and speculations. So in the book, I call this umbrella of responses subjunctive aesthetics in a nod to the grammatical mood that is the realm of the potential and the uncertain. For those of us that teach language classes, right, grammatical moods are normally divided into two categories, realis and irrealis. And realis is sort of the realm of what is, right? It's the indicative tense. It talks about evidence and truth. Irrealis, by contrast, incorporates things like the subjunctive as well as the conditional, right? In order to talk about not have this commitment to one singular or fixed truth. The subjunctive instead encodes the speaker's uncertainty or opinions about how things are. It's used to respond to reality in a way that expresses its potential to change or the speaker's desire for it to change. So my book argues that by thinking about the subjunctive not just as a grammatical mood, but as an aesthetic category, we might better understand how contemporary cultural responses to environmental crisis use doubt, contingency, and desire to sort of dispute the way things are, right? Extractive paradigms, extractive capitalism, dispossession, et cetera, in order to imagine how the world could be or should be. And so in the introduction, I talk about how I see subjunctive aesthetics as sort of the counterpart to forensic aesthetics, or its mirror image, the other side of the coin, right? Both forensic aesthetics and subjunctive aesthetics respond to situations of material damage and the violent foreclosure of life. But whereas forensic aesthetics sustain an anthropological focus on witnessing and marshal evidence toward a shared truth, subjunctive aesthetics tilt away from fact-gathering and narrative certainty and instead move toward knowledge-making practices that are mobilized by doubt, emotion, and the imagination. I think about these responses as modeling the Zapatista call to imagine un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, right? Or a world where many worlds might fit. So this idea of multiplicity and possibility and uncertainty. And so in the introduction to the book, I sort of talk about different ways of thinking about the subjunctive, not just as a grammatical mode, but as sort of a more expansive philosophical category. And I'm going to talk briefly about the third quote here, which is by the Indian novelist and theorist Amitav Ghosh, whom I'm sure everyone here has read. And in his book, The Great Derangement, he talks about how quote, to reproduce the world as it exists should not be the project of fiction. What fiction makes possible is to approach the world in a subjunctive mode, to conceive of it as if it were other than it is. So I really think that this as if is really key, and it's been important to my own thinking on what art can do. So rather than see art as serving sort of this ancillary or secondary or illustrative or didactic role in sort of proving environmental damage, right, as always being sort of subordinate to science or economics or politics. I think that, like, as cultural theorists, we should give art more credit, right? And so by sort of focusing in on the subjunctive capacity of art, I want to sort of argue for art's ability to create in the world, right? To generate alternative narratives, values, and ways of seeing. And so subjunctive aesthetics sort of center the role of desire in producing the future, right? And mobilizing this as if, right? So to sort of echo Kierkegaard from the first quote here, right? Like, before we can do something in the world, we first have to think about it. We first have to imagine it. And so art can sort of perform this imaginative pre-work before that happens as sort of a necessary prerequisite to political action. Okay, so at the same time that I'm really, sort of hopeful about what art can perform, the book also is interested in sort of delimiting what art can actually do in the world, right? Because art is not the same as political action, in my opinion. So this imaginative potential, I suggest, always emerges from within concrete historical circumstances and modes of production. And so here I'm also inspired by the subjunctive as a grammatical mode, right? The subjunctive got its name because it's placed normally in subordinate clauses, right? The secondary clause. The subjunctive often bridges two different subjects, appearing in the dependent clause in response to conditions that are imposed by the main clause. In this way, the subjunctive, sort of as a grammatical structure, models relationality, but it also models the way that subjects exist in reliance or subordination to one another. So extrapolated to think about subjunctive aesthetics, the subjunctive mood mirrors the way that we're compelled to respond to pre-existing planetary conditions, pre-existing economic structures, right? So all of this, right, really conditions what art and what the imagination can do. Our subordination to these pre-existing structures indexes that regardless of how much we might react to, negate, or wish the world were different, right, we cannot reinvent the earth. However, what we can do is reinvent the way that we relate to it and to each other. Okay, so then to sort of summarize the main argument of the book, or the way that I define subjunctive aesthetics, I really see it as modeling three main characteristics, right? The first is that most of the subjunctive aesthetics that I'm interested in are responding to some sort of foreclosure of the future. And today we're going to talk about extinction as one of those foreclosures, and sort of subjunctive responses that attempt to sort of trouble that foreclosure as definite or conclusive. The second characteristic of subjunctive aesthetics is that they're less interested in evidence and more interested in imaginative potential. And the third characteristic of subjunctive aesthetics is that it always sort of is modulated by this state of subordination and entanglement. So the book has 5 chapters. These chapters look at a variety of different cultural objects and sort of theorize different forms of subjunctive aesthetic responses. In the first chapter, I talk about environmental rewriting through the work of Mexican visual artist and writer Veronica Gerber-Bisecchi, in which she rewrites canonical Mexican texts by Amparo Dávila and José Juan Tablada, and sort of dwells in those texts and makes small modifications in order to make them speak to environmental crisis. And so there she's sort of performing this as if, right? As if these texts had been written today, how would they have been written differently? The second chapter looks at the murder of land defenders in Mexico, and it looks at activist responses to those murders that deny the conclusiveness of that murder. So often these activist slogans are something like Samir vive, right? And so they sort of emphasize the continued life of the activist, even though they're dead. And so I call this form of response a counterfactual form of mourning. And I look at a performance artist, Naomi Rincon Gallardo, who you can see here on her work on the top left. as sort of the speculative form of mourning. The third chapter that I'll talk a little bit about more in a moment is about poets in Mexico who are responding to extinction. The fourth chapter looks at documentaries that are about drought or flooding in Mexico and use sort of sensorial immersion to depict those forms of abundance or lack of water. And then the last chapter sort of makes a pivot to think about cultural infrastructures, and it looks at filmmakers and cultural infrastructure makers in Mexico who are trying to green Mexican cinema by making it more carbon neutral, right? And so on the image on the bottom left here, you can see an example from that chapter that's about this group that brings cinema to rural Mexican populations where they don't have permanent movie theaters, and they have children and the public sort of generate the energy for those film productions. Okay. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more about the third chapter on extinction poetics. And I open the chapter thinking about sort of the limits of representation, right? Because I think that one of the arguments that is sort of commonplace in our field is like, visibility, increased representation, increased visibility translates automatically into political action. And I sort of doubt that this is the case. And so one of the things that I talk about is that in the last 5 years, the Mexican government has released a new set of banknotes, a new set of currency that all depict sort of an endangered or iconic animal from Mexico. These include like the gray whale and the axolotl, which you can see here on your screen. And so one of the things that I talk about is like, okay, here's like a huge representational push, right? Every person in Mexico now has a bill, right, with the axolotl on it. And yet, does this bill really give us information about the axolotl's endangerment, right? It looks kind of happy here in its habitat, like we don't really get a sense that it's endangered or what we should be doing about it. And also, fascinatingly, there were these public documents about the all the what are they called? Like the groups that reviewed these bill mock-ups, and they decided that the axolotl looked too ugly. And so then the designers like modified the look of the axolotl to make it more cute and more appealing. And so I'm kind of interested in the way in which sort of increased representation and familiarity is often still based on these anthropocentric ideals. But regardless, these new banknotes were highly successful. People love this axolotl bill. So much so that people were joking on Twitter that like the reason the Mexican economy had been stalling or in a recession was not because of the COVID pandemic, but because people didn't want to use their axolotl bills. They were holding on to them. Okay, so sort of a similar critique to the one that I argue about, sort of what representation can't do, is performed by the Mexican poet Isabel Zapata in her book Una ballena es un país. And she has this lovely poem called Miembro Fantasma that's about the Tasmanian tiger, where she sort of very succinctly, I think, argues that humans, or, we might say Westerners, are fascinated by animals that no longer exist, and that we only really begin to care about them once they're gone, once they've been lost. We don't care about them sort of in the endangered period in the lead up. And so she sort of concludes her poem saying, celebramos la vida que existe, la sombra que avanza sin un cuerpo. And she diagnoses this as sort of a phantom limb syndrome, right? This idea that we feel the pain of something that's lost more than we care about it when it's actually present in the world. And so based on sort of the theory that Zapata puts forward in the chapter, I sort of think about how writers can sort of respond to this challenge of writing about endangered or extinct species without transforming them into, right, either like this cute axolotl or into this phantom limb, right? This sort of fantasy of familiarity. And so I look mainly at three different books of poetry: Dodo by Karen Villeda, El Sueño de Toda Célula by Maricela Guerrero, which might be the one that most people are familiar with. This book in the center is out in English translation as The Dream of Every Cell. It's a lovely book. It teaches super well for those of you that teach environmental classes. And then Jaws by Cici Rodriguez Mendoza, which is the book that I'm going to talk about most today. So my argument in this chapter is that rather than sort of create intimacy through familiarity or knowledge, what these poets do is that they use contiguity, which is a formal property of poetry, right? It's the way that a poem can bring a lot of weird and different things into the same space, a small space of the poem, right? So contiguity, right, the poem is a contracted space where a vast array of things can be brought into relation through associations that range from the conceptual to the sonic to the incongruent. We might even say that poetry is sort of a form that's defined by contiguity, more so than any other form of literature, precisely because of the importance of the distribution of words on the page, the arrangement of space, including blank space, and the recurrence of certain sounds, images, and tropes. Contiguity is also the operative logic behind many figures of speech, right? Poetry establishes relations of proximity through metaphor, through simile, through alliteration. So through these mechanisms of association, poetry can establish a relationship of proximity that is also not a form of reducing or flattening out difference. And that's what I think that these poets are interested in doing. And so, like rewriting and counterfactual mourning, I identify contiguity as sort of another subjunctive strategy that mobilizes imaginative engagement to sort of contest foreclosure. Echoing how the subjunctive grammatical mood gives expression to imagined possibilities from a site of enunciation grounded in the real, contiguity puts readers into ephemeral contact with endangered non-human life, but only through the realm of the imagination. This hypothetical encounter with the non-human other in the space of the poem never sort of coalesces in these particular books into sort of a certainty of knowledge or evidence of facts about these forms of extinction, but it always sort of remains within the realm of the potential of proposition and suggestion, inviting interpretation and inquiry. Okay, so we see this at work in Citlali Rodriguez Mendoza's 2015 poetry collection, Jaws, Tiburon, which is available on the internet for a free download, and I suggest that you go find it. Sorry that you probably can't access this link, but if you just Google it, it will appear. So one of the wonderful things about this book of poetry is that it sort of emulates the movement of sharks through the staccato, breathless form in which the poem just sort of washes over you as a reader. The book plays with the ideas that we have about sharks, right? Through the titular Jaws, right? The shark is this apex predator who's terrifying and a threat to human life. And it sort of subverts those commonplace understandings by sort of focusing on sharks' vulnerability to overfishing and other forms of commodification. So the way that the collection sort of inaugurates this connection between the speaker and the shark is through the experience of sleep apnea, which is when you're sleeping but you're not breathing well, and so you're momentarily sort of like awaking based on the lack of air. Okay, so this momentary asphyxiation is what awakens the speaker, who's reborn during the dreamlike trance of interrupted sleep as Jaws, right? As this shark, right? Tintorera, como todo animal tengo nombre, y mi nombre significa, representa Jaws, es otro, pero en el fondo es el mismo, right? So we can see here how from the start of the book of poems, the speaker sort of creates this ontological unfolding by saying that they are Jaws, but then also in the next breath saying that Jaws is the other, right? So the poem's lineation sort of establishes this slippage between meaning and representation, between Jaws as the self and Jaws as the other. And this sort of theme of the self and the other as one and the same, as different, is what structures really the entire work. The phrase esto es agua is repeated in the book such that it becomes sort of like a mantra or a refrain. And here she's referring to the idea that water is the shared source of life, right? Humans, 60% of our bodies are made up with water, and sharks extract oxygen from water in order to breathe. And yet the shared identification is always undermined by the fact that it's utterly different, right? Sharks, to stay alive, need to be inside the water. Humans inside the water, we would die, we would asphyxiate. So metaphorically, this state of asphyxiation is what allows the speaker to transform from one state into the other, from death into life and from human into shark. Another organizing thread from this book is the commodification of life on a planet that's organized by transnational trade. So in one poem called Aleteo de Tiburones, which means shark finning, the poetic voice adopts the perspective of an asphyxiating shark whose fins have been cut off and who has been dumped back in the ocean to die. So the practice of shark finning is really ruthlessly efficient, right? Fishing boats optimize space by only storing the shark's most valuable body part, which is its fins, and then they discard the rest of the shark's body back into the ocean, where the sharks sink and suffocate because they can no longer continue to swim. About 100 million sharks are killed this way every year to meet the booming demand for shark fin, which is a delicacy in Chinese cuisine. So in Aleteo de Tiburones, in this poem, the speaker adopts the perspective of this definned shark, whose deathbed musings sort of swirl together like the jumble of trash that clouds the water around it as it sinks. The breathless final stanza reckons with the denial that underpins the practice of releasing a creature back to the water after taking the parts that it needs to live. Agua, and here you have the English translation of the part that I'm reading. Agua, saben que estoy vivo, que muero, que caigo. No creen en mi extinción. Soy increíble, como el dolor dorsal, como el agua. Solo ella cree en mí, porque ha metido su mano en mis branquias. Eso es. And so here, Rodriguez sort of differentiates knowing about the harm that's caused by a practice like shark finning from believing or creer that it leads to extinction. And the only entity that sort of has this belief in the shark's extinction is water because of its material proximity with sharks. And so as humans, right, this material proximity is impossible, right, because we cannot exist in the same water as sharks. But through sort of the imaginative space of the poem sort of permits this penetration, this understanding. So overfishing, of course, has sort of led to a sharp decline in sharks worldwide. In Mexico, of the 111 shark species that inhabit the ocean, many are considered collapsed, which means depleted by 90% or overfished. Yet, as this book of poems demonstrates from its very title, like we rarely think of sharks as vulnerable to extinction because we think of them as Jaws, as this sort of predator, apex predator. Okay, let me see. I'm going to jump forward so that we can have time for conversations. Throughout the rest of the poem, then Rodriguez creates this relationship between sharks that are commodified for their bodies with Mexican workers who are equally commodified. So you can see how later in the same poem about shark finning, she sort of describes, right, creates these analogies between sharks that have been definned and children who have to take English classes and computer classes, or workers whose contracts are rescinded. So it's sort of like this idea of the precarity of life under neoliberal economic structures. sort of later in the poem, it moves more directly, right, to Jaws no longer inhabits the voice of the shark, but rather the voice of one of these workers, right? A worker who, like a shark, has to move from job to job because of the precarity of labor. So, también he servido en un hostal y repartido baguettes porque los tiburones somos útiles en el área de turismo, pagan por vernos trabajar, huir, digamos, y tras nosotros funcionan barcos y tripulaciones, redes en movimiento. La cacería de mi cuerpo es el trabajo de alguien, señor. And so the stream of conscious narration really fluidly moves or jumps, right, between the perspective of the unemployed man who's seeking work into the perspective of the shark who is hunted by someone else, right? So it's sort of like this fact that there's no out, right? This man who is unemployed, perhaps he'll become the hunter of the shark. And these perspectives sort of momentarily merge in the poem into the use of the we, right? Los tiburones somos útiles, pagan por vernos, right? And so there's this like momentary shared identification between the self as sort of the instrument of destruction, the self as labor, the self as commodity, and that sort of moves across species into sort of this shared moment that then moves back out into these different species. And so what I talk about in the book, in my analysis, is that this logic of contiguity that Rodriguez uses by placing these species next to each other, by sort of at times sort of confusing or merging their perspectives, allows us to sort of think about the world through a materialist conceptualization as a world that's fundamentally entangled, yet ontologically distinct, right? Like we're not the same, yet there are similarities. And so to conclude, this slipping and merging and cleaving of human and shark speakers sort of gestures at the shared political terrain that politically or that potentially unites these distinct life forms, right? That are both preyed upon by capital and creates this fleeting moment of commonality. Jaw's analogical ethos brings human and non-human into the contiguous relation, into shared proximity through the space of the poem. And Rodriguez uses contiguity as sort of a proxy for proximity, for physical proximity, to dramatize what poetry can do as an artistic practice. So poetry can do more than simply sort of evidencing extinction or decrying it, critiquing it, which is something that I see more operative in sort of earlier forms of extinction poetry in Mexico by poets like Homero Arigis or Jose Emilio Pacheco, who are more interested in sort of pointing out these processes are happening and criticizing them. And we don't really see that in Rodriguez's poetry. Rather, what we see is sort of this artistic play with perspective and with trying to identify the larger structures that are at work in creating this world that has sort of preyed upon human and non-human life. And so I talk about in the chapter about how by looking at these books of poetry, we can see what poetry can do beyond simply evidencing extinction or making it visible. It can serve as a method of expression that potentially reorients how we see, experience, and speak about the world. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was super interesting. Thank you for those rich analyses. And wow, I have questions. Gianfranco probably has some questions too as well. And if anyone else wants to contribute to the discussion, please feel free to share your comments and questions in the chat. So Carolyn, I'm certainly with you when you say that increasing visibility does not necessarily translate automatically into political action. So you referred to that when you were talking about the limits of representation. And yeah, that really made me think about some instances of that I analyze in my own work, but I would love to hear from you if you would be interested in expanding on that, elaborating more and thinking through examples that you analyzed in your own work. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Jamille. Yeah, I mean, I think that what's hard is if we are invested in sort of thinking about visibility and how it translates into concrete political action, it kind of narrows the scope of what the objects that we can analyze, I think, as cultural critics, because, for example, this book of poetry didn't circulate a lot, so it didn't have a lot of consumption. And so if what we're interested in making is an argument about sort of like visibility translates into political action, then I think it makes it harder to sort of think about what aesthetic objects can do or what experimental aesthetic objects can do, or what's the point of making art if not a lot of people are seeing it. And so I think sometimes it helps to think through these counterexamples that would really prove that argument, right? And so they're like these banknotes, right, that are sort of the ultimate example of a representational object that has reached the masses. Like everybody has these. It's like, does that sort of prove the hypothesis that what we need is more visibility, more sort of diffusion of information, and what does that produce? So I guess I would say that that's sort of one of the arguments, or one of the things that I attempt to think through in the book, which is like what other arguments can we make about art? And I guess here I'm also sort of thinking with Rob Nixon, right, who talks about environmental crisis as a representational challenge. And so beyond sort of just representational proof, like what else can different artistic objects perform? And that's sort of what the book is interested in looking at.
Thank you, Karen. And Gianfranco, do you have any questions that you would like to share?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Carolyn. That was fascinating, as usual. I think I have a more concrete question about the talk you gave us, and then I can jump into other like more broad things related to the book. But reading the introduction of subjunctive aesthetics, I was interested about these kind of relation or difference you pose between speculation and contiguity. And you talk about, I would just like to hear about, the difference you make between both. I know you relate both within the framework of subjunctive aesthetics, but what's, what differentiates, speculation from contiguity and all these different remarks you make.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, so in the introduction, one of the things that I talk about is that the book, I think, honestly, I started the book thinking about speculation and climate change. But then I realized that I was interested in something that was broader than speculation. Because I think of speculation, right? So speculation is the non-real, right? We might think about speculation as related to sci-fi, the fantastic, magical realism, right? So speculations are forms of non-real imagination. But I was interested in sort of thinking even more broadly about speculation, which is how I arrived to think about the subjunctive. And sort of thinking about the subjunctive as this mode of irrealis that sort of allows space for not just speculation of alternative worlds, but also sort of doubting, opinionating, opining, right? Fears, which I think all of these are very like potent forms of cultural response to environmental crisis. And so that was why I decided to frame the book through the subjunctive rather than through speculation, because I wasn't necessarily interested in making an argument about a specific genre or form. but rather more about like the operation through which art performs this questioning of the real. And so that questioning of the real isn't always a proposal of another world, but it can be a questioning that's produced by, for example, putting unexpected things into relation, right? And so that's how I would say, it's kind of leading me into what you're asking me about contiguity versus speculation, which is that as we see in this book of poetry that I was talking about today, what the book does is it sort of, it's playing with perspective. I guess we could call it a form of speculation because it's speculating that the eye is inhabiting the shark. But there isn't like necessarily an alternative world that's being formulated there. It's like the world that we exist, but it's just sort of playing with imagination of how the eye can be inside the shark or inside the worker. And so, but both of those things, so contiguity, which is sort of the unexpected placement in close relations of things that cannot be in close relation otherwise, and speculation, as in other chapters, right? Like, for example, the second chapter about counterfactual speculation, which Naomi Rincon Gallardo, there is creating sort of these alternative worlds, the underworld, the inframundo, where these dead activists sort of join forces. They're sort of operating differently, but what I see as uniting those is sort of this shared vision of art as sort of the space where these unexpected relations can be formulated in a way that sort of critiques the status quo.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. I was thinking about the concept of the phantomling, miembro fantasma, right, in relation to environmental consciousness and mourning. So could you expand on that as well, and in relation to this Poetics of Extinction?
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, I find this idea by Isabel Zapata so fascinating. I think that it like so succinctly consolidates or like expresses, right, one of the primary problems of representing the non-human, which is how do we represent the non-human without transforming it into a human body part, right? Meaning how do we represent the non-human and resist anthropomorphism, or so that's on the one hand, how do we resist anthropomorphism, which maybe is not always a bad thing, right? But the other problem of the miembro fantasma is that, or according to Zapata, is that like, why are we mostly interested in creatures once they're extinct, and why do we not care about caring for them when they're still around? And in her poem Miembro Fantasma, she talks about the Tasmanian tiger that was hunted to extinction because it was seen as a threat to farmers. This was encouraged by the state, I think in Australia, right, where they provided money to hunters who hunted these creatures that were seen as sort of a threat to chickens and other forms of livestock. And then she talks about the afterlife of the extinction of this animal, in which people have repeatedly insisted that they've seen the Tasmanian tiger. People are out there trying to find it, right? And so it's in her poem, she talks about how the Tasmanian tiger has become like this like the Loch Ness monster, or these other sort of fantastical creatures that have like a real attraction because of their absence. And so I think that there's sort of like a dual problem there, which is how do you talk about the endangered or the extinct without sort of transforming it into this fetishistic object of like just desire because of its rareness, right? Rarity. And on the other hand, like, how do we represent the endangered or the extinct without sort of transforming it into or translating it into human terms? And so what I love about that poem is that it doesn't sort of provide the answer to these difficult questions, but it sort of diagnoses in a sort of a self-reflexive way, which is like the difficulty of being an author who's interested in writing about environmental issues, but also these traps, these pitfalls that are like really easy to fall into and really difficult to avoid. And so I think it's a marvelous poem that really probably communicates far better than I could of like what the challenges for authors and for the task of literary representation is, and the way that literature and art itself has sort of perpetuated these problems of sort of creating the mystique around the extinct, and not sort of valuing creatures while they're still alive and still still could be saved from extinction.
Yes, absolutely. One aspect of your research that you've touched on it today, but it would be great to hear more about it, has to do with cultural infrastructure, the recognition of implication, the acknowledgement of artists' involvement within extractive economies, right? And how this recognition impacts their ethical and creative choices. And of course, I'm thinking about the example of Cine Mobile Toto, right? Decarbonizing methods of, film exhibition and filmmaking. So yeah, if you would like to share more thoughts on this grassroots approaches to creative methods, that would be great.
Thanks. Thanks. I think that this idea of all of our implication or complicity within the processes that we're aiming to critique is something that's really fascinating to me. And I think that maybe I in the past, I'm always like, the things that I'm writing about, I'm always like critiquing myself, my own past arguments. I think that there maybe in the past, I had this tendency to sort of think about art as being outside of these systems, right? Art as sort of an external space of critique. I think it's sort of easy to fall into this sort of argument or argumentative construction that like art is critiquing these things, but actually art is within these things, as are all of us, right? And so I really love it when artists recognize that what I like to think about of is implication, not necessarily complicity is like maybe too strong of a word. Implication just means like embeddedness within these processes. And so I love it when artists acknowledge or reckon or struggle with these forms of implication. And so I actually think that the Miembro Fantasma poem is a perfect example of this because it's sort of a recognition of how literary form or representational forms have sort of perpetuated these problems rather than combating them, or like perpetuated and combat them at the same time. And so I have an article out. Actually, maybe I can put it in the chat, in the journal Forma, that where I talk about, like sort of the reflexive attempts to reckon with, okay, there we go. Reflexive attempts to sort of engage with this implication or to acknowledge this implication, because particularly in Mexico, the most important art biennale is called the FEMSA Art Biennale. I talk about this a little bit in the book. FEMSA is a bottling company that works with Coca-Cola and Heineken. And FEMSA has been sort of for 30 years, they've been had these massive water concessions in areas that are where water is scarce. So, for example, in Chiapas, there have been these long ongoing conflicts between indigenous communities and FEMSA over water use. Okay, so that on the one hand. On the other hand, FEMSA as the company has a nonprofit corollary that runs this art biennale, which is the most important contemporary art show for young artists in Mexico. And a lot of the works that I study, the environmentalist works, are actually sort of produced and funded by FEMSA. So Veronica Guerra-Bisecchi's work, La Compañía, Naomi Rincon Gallardo's performance pieces, Sangre Pesada, were all debuted at one of these FEMSA biennials, which means that they were commissioned and paid for by FEMSA. And so I'm really interested in sort of this contradiction, which is that like these really powerful critiques of extractivism are funded by extractivism. And so what does that mean for us as cultural critics? How can we acknowledge that in our analyses of these works? It doesn't discard the work that it doesn't discard the powerful work that the work is doing. But at the same time, I think it also tells us something about the state of art in today's society and the state of arts funding and the difficult nature of being implicated in extractivism, right? I'm sure I could say the same thing of, Cornell, I'm sure is invested in fossil fuels, and here I am, right? Like critiquing it. And so I think I find it to be very useful and interesting to sort of think about these complicities or implications. And so that's what I do in the article that I put in the chat, and I do it a little bit in the conclusion of the book. And so one of the things I like about Cinema del Toto, sorry, this answer has got extended a little bit. Cinema del Toto, in the last chapter of the book, I'm interested in how filmmakers in particular are thinking about not just making films with environmental messaging, but how they can change the practice of filmmaking to make filmmaking itself have less of an environmental impact. And so with Cinema del Toto, that's sort of one experiment with sort of creating an alternative structure for film showing that is both driven by environmental justice, right? The use of solar panels, of biking, having carbon neutral film screenings, but it's also driven by social justice, which is bringing culture to rural areas of rural communities that don't have sort of access otherwise. So I think it's really wonderful to see sort of these experiments with how we can change or transform culture, not just through representation, but through like practice.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, for sharing your work with us, for engaging with our questions. We are moving towards the end of our event, but I just wanted to emphasize how grateful we are. It's been a joy and an honor to have you with us. We did want to announce the other events that we have coming up in this series. Gianfranco, you have the details for them?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Thank you, Caroline, again, for a wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it. I'm just going to share these here so you guys can access it. So we have two events coming up. The first one is Energizing Energy Politics, which will take place on October 30th. With Imra Seman from the University of Toronto and Jennifer Wenzel from Columbia University. And on November 27, we have Elements and Energies with Dominic Boyer and Simen Howie from Rice University. So please feel free to register, and I'm looking forward to having you online for this event too. Thank you.
Well, what a great program. Thanks to both of you for the invitation, and thanks everyone for spending your Tuesday afternoon or morning, wherever you are.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Gianfranco. Thank you. Gracias, obrigada.